The interstellar archive station drifted in silent orbit above the pale blue glow of the planet Asteron, a quiet monument to the galaxy's obsession with its own forgotten past. Thousands of civilizations had risen, collapsed, vanished, and left behind fragments, symbols etched into alien metals, recordings encoded in obsolete star languages, and tablets older than most inhabited worlds. The station existed for one purpose: to listen to the ghosts those fragments left behind. Adrian Vale spent most of his days surrounded by those ghosts. The room he worked in was filled with hovering projection panels and ancient artifacts suspended in low-gravity containment fields. Lines of alien script floated above his desk like faint constellations. Some of the symbols had been dead for over 800 years. Adrian liked to imagine they were slightly annoyed about it. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes after several hours of translation work. "All right," he muttered to the glowing symbols in front of him. "Either you mean eternal royal bloodline, or you mean ceremonial kitchen storage. And frankly, both possibilities worry me." The station's translation AI hummed softly. "Probability suggests royal bloodline," the system replied. Adrian sighed. "Good, because if an ancient empire collapsed over soup bowls, historians are going to be very disappointed." He turned back toward the projection, analyzing the structure of the Illyrian language, an ancient alien civilization that had once dominated entire star systems before mysteriously fading into history. Their language fascinated him. It was elegant, mathematical, layered with meaning in ways that felt almost alive. And at the center of that long-lost civilization was the only Illyrian still alive: Queen Lysara. Adrian had never met her before, but everyone in the station knew she would be arriving that day. The last living ruler of a fallen empire was not exactly a casual visitor. He checked his notes again. The Illyrian royal naming system was particularly complicated. Each monarch possessed multiple titles, ceremonial names, dynastic markers, and, according to several obscure fragments, something called a true lineage identifier, which sounded suspiciously like a secret name. Adrian tapped his stylus against the table thoughtfully. "Of course the ancient alien monarchy had secret names," he murmured, "because being a queen apparently isn't stressful enough." The station doors opened quietly behind him. Adrian didn't notice at first. He was too focused on reconstructing a missing portion of an Illyrian inscription that had been damaged centuries ago. The fragment floated above his desk, glowing faintly as the system filled in possible translations. He examined the linguistic pattern carefully. "Let's see," he said slowly. "Dynastic marker, ancestral suffix, personal lineage identifier." The pieces suddenly aligned in his mind. Adrian smiled with the quiet excitement of someone who had just solved a puzzle no one else had noticed. "Ah," he said. He stood and turned toward the presentation display at the front of the chamber, activating the projection that would explain his reconstruction to the visiting delegation. Only then did he realize the room was no longer empty. A group of station officials stood near the entrance. Two tall armored guards flanked them, and between them stood a woman who seemed strangely calm in the center of so much attention. She looked almost human, tall, composed, with pale silver hair falling over her shoulders, but the long, elegant ears curving gently behind her hair revealed the truth immediately. Queen Lysara of Ayria. Adrian blinked once, then twice. "Oh," he said quietly. He had not expected the Queen herself to attend the linguistic briefing. "Well," Adrian said awkwardly, clearing his throat, "this presentation suddenly feels much more official than I planned." One of the station administrators gestured for him to continue. Adrian turned back to the projection, trying very hard to act like he had not just accidentally begun explaining an alien queen's ancient royal language directly in front of her. "As I was saying," he continued, "Illyrian royal names follow a tri-layered structure: titles first, dynastic identifiers second, and finally a personal lineage marker." Symbols rearranged themselves on the display. Adrian pointed to the reconstructed inscription. This fragment references a monarch whose public title would translate roughly as Queen Lysara. However, the deeper linguistic structure suggests the existence of an older personal designation embedded in the royal record. He zoomed in on the final line of symbols. "Based on the grammatical structure, Adrian explained confidently. The original dynastic name would logically resolve as... He paused briefly while the final translation finished calculating. Lysara Valthrin. The room became completely silent. Adrian noticed the silence about 3 seconds too late. He slowly turned around. The guards had gone very still. The station administrators looked deeply uncomfortable, and Queen Lysara was staring directly at him. Her expression was calm, but there was something sharp behind her eyes now. She stepped forward slightly. "No one," she said quietly, "knows that name." Adrian felt his brain attempt several explanations at once and reject all of them. "Well," he said carefully, "that's statistically surprising." One of the guards reached for a security device. Adrian raised both hands. "In my defense," he added quickly, "I genuinely thought it was historical trivia." The Queen continued watching him, her gaze thoughtful now rather than angry. "How did you learn it?" she asked. Adrian looked back at the floating translation, then at her, then back at the symbols. "I translated it?" The guard closest to him muttered something in a language Adrian definitely hoped did not mean, "Arrest the linguist." Queen Lysara studied him for several seconds longer. Then she said something even more unsettling. "That name," she said quietly, "was never written in any surviving record." Adrian swallowed. "Well," he said, forcing a weak smile, "that complicates my research notes." The silence in the archive chamber did not disappear quickly. It lingered in the air like an uncomfortable guest who had decided to stay for dinner. Adrian was still standing beside the projection table with both hands slightly raised, which he now realized made him look suspiciously like someone who had just committed a crime involving ancient languages. He slowly lowered his arms. "Before anyone activates the dramatic arrest procedure," Adrian said cautiously, "I would just like to point out that I work with words, not conspiracies." No one laughed. Queen Lysara remained perfectly still, studying him with a calm expression that was somehow far more intimidating than the guard's armor. Behind her, one of the station administrators cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty," the administrator said carefully, "perhaps this is simply a coincidence in linguistic reconstruction." Lysara raised one elegant hand slightly. The administrator stopped talking immediately. Her long ears tilted ever so slightly backward as she continued observing Adrian. He had the strange feeling she was measuring every tiny detail about him, the way a scientist might study an unfamiliar species. Adrian tried not to move too much, mostly because the guards had now taken 2 slow steps closer. "So," Adrian said after a moment, "hypothetically speaking, how serious of a problem is it that I said that name?" One of the guards answered before the Queen could. "Very serious." Adrian nodded. "Yes, that seems fair." Queen Lysara finally spoke again. "That name," she said calmly, "is my birth name. It was never spoken outside my family line, not recorded in public archives, not used in diplomacy, not even written in royal memory tablets." Adrian blinked. "That sounds extremely inconvenient for my career." The guards did not react. The Queen's expression, however, shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "You claim you derived it from the ancient inscription?" she asked. Adrian turned and pointed at the floating text again. "Yes, the grammar structure reveals a concealed lineage marker embedded beneath the ceremonial titles. When I removed the later imperial formatting, the base name pattern became obvious." He paused. "Well, obvious to someone who spends 14 hours a day arguing with extinct alphabets." The Queen stepped closer to the projection. Her eyes moved slowly across the symbols Adrian had reconstructed. Adrian watched her carefully. For a moment, the calm confidence she had carried since entering the chamber flickered. "Just slightly. You reconstructed the ancestral suffix correctly," she said quietly. Adrian tilted his head. "That's good, right?" Lysara did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached toward the projection field, adjusting the holographic text with a small gesture. New layers of ancient Illyrian symbols appeared beneath Adrian's translation, older dialects, deeper linguistic roots. Adrian leaned forward in fascination. "Oh," he whispered, "that's the pre-imperial structure." One of the guards looked confused. "You understand this?" the guard asked. Adrian nodded enthusiastically. Of course, this is the early dynastic grammar form. It predates the collapse by at least 3 centuries. The guard stared at him. You identified that in 3 seconds. Adrian shrugged. I've had a lot of coffee. Queen Lysara looked back at him. You speak of my people's language as if you lived among them. Adrian laughed softly. Oh, not at all. If I had lived among your people, I would have been exiled within a week. Why? I asked too many questions. One of the station officials quietly whispered, That is true. Lysara slowly walked around the projection table, examining Adrian's work more closely. The long folds of her dark ceremonial coat moved almost silently behind her. Adrian noticed the faint silver patterns woven into the fabric, ancient Illyrian royal markings. Your reconstruction of the name, she said, is not only correct, it is precise down to the phonetic root. Adrian smiled proudly. I knew the vowel structure looked right. The queen looked at him again. You do not seem surprised. Adrian scratched the back of his head. Well, I'm surprised that it turned out to be a secret royal name. He gestured toward the floating symbols. But linguistically speaking, the pattern was unavoidable. Your civilization built names like mathematical equations. Once you understand the structure, the missing pieces solve themselves. The room grew quiet again. Lysara turned her attention back to the translation. Those structures, she said softly, were lost when my empire fell. Adrian frowned slightly. That's the strange part. He activated another projection layer. Dozens of translated fragments appeared in the air around them. Ancient inscriptions, cultural texts, pieces of Illyrian poetry, military logs, all reconstructed. Lysara's eyes widened slightly. You translated all of these? Adrian nodded. Over the past 6 months. The queen slowly walked through the floating projections, reading them one by one. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, she stopped beside one of the inscriptions. This one, she said quietly. Where did you find it? Adrian leaned over to check. Oh, that fragment was incomplete. I filled the missing sections based on syntax probabilities. Lysara read the translation again. Her voice became very quiet. That passage describes the final evacuation of my homeworld. Adrian blinked. Oh. He looked back at the projection. Well, that explains why the grammar felt so dramatic. The queen turned slowly toward him. That event was never recorded outside Illyrian memory vaults. Adrian's smile faded slightly. Right, he said. He looked around the room, at the guards, at the administrators, at the queen. So, just to clarify, Adrian said carefully, am I accidentally uncovering lost history or accidentally committing treason against an extinct empire? One of the guards answered immediately. We are still deciding. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. Fair. Queen Lysara continued watching him. Then she said something none of them expected. Continue your work. The administrators looked stunned. Your Majesty, one of them began. She raised her hand again. I want to see how much more of my people's past this human can recover. Adrian brightened slightly. That sounds significantly better than prison. One guard crossed his arms. For now. Adrian sighed. History truly is dangerous. The following morning, the archive station felt less like a research facility and more like a quiet diplomatic battlefield. Adrian noticed it immediately. Normally, the interstellar archive hummed with the relaxed chaos of scholars arguing about grammar and archaeologists trying to convince computers that a cracked alien symbol was not, in fact, a decorative vegetable. Today, the hallways were lined with security officers. Apparently, translating a secret royal name had consequences. Adrian walked into the main linguistic chamber, carrying a cup of synthetic coffee and the uneasy awareness that at least 4 armed guards were pretending not to watch him. He raised the cup slightly toward them. Good morning, he said. None of them answered. Still not coffee, people, Adrian muttered. Inside the chamber, the enormous holographic archive display was already active. Thousands of ancient Illyrian symbols floated slowly in the air, like fragments of a broken constellation. And standing in the center of it all was Queen Lysara. She had removed the formal ceremonial cloak she wore the day before. Without it, her appearance seemed less distant, though her posture still carried the quiet authority of someone who had ruled star systems. Her long ears were clearly visible now, angled slightly back as she studied the floating language patterns around her. Adrian stopped for a moment. It was strange seeing someone observe their own civilization the way historians usually studied extinct species. "Good morning," Adrian said. The Queen turned toward him. "You arrived late," she said calmly. Adrian checked the wall clock. "It is 8:02. "Yes," she replied. Adrian raised a finger. "In academic time, that is extremely punctual." The Queen watched him for a moment. Then she returned her attention to the floating text. "You reconstructed several additional Illyrian records overnight," she said. Adrian brightened slightly. "Ah, you saw those." He walked toward the projection console, setting his coffee carefully beside the control panel. "I couldn't sleep," he explained. "Every time I closed my eyes, my brain kept trying to solve your language's verb conjugation system." "That sounds unpleasant." It really was. He activated a new layer of translations. Ancient Illyrian writing spread across the chamber like a glowing web of language. "This section," Adrian said, pointing to one cluster of symbols, "appears to be an early cultural record. It describes something like a public debate among royal advisors." Lysara leaned closer. Her expression shifted almost immediately. "That is not a debate." Adrian frowned. "It isn't." "No." She pointed to one of the symbols. "That phrase refers to ceremonial insult exchanges." Adrian blinked. "Ceremonial insults." "Yes." He leaned closer to the translation. "Oh." He scrolled through the reconstructed text again. "Well, that explains why the grammar kept sounding aggressive." The Queen tilted her head slightly. "What did you translate it as?" Adrian hesitated. "Diplomatic philosophical disagreement." Lysara stared at him. "That passage literally says, 'Your ancestors' wisdom is comparable to a malfunctioning agricultural drone.'" Adrian slowly nodded. "That is significantly less diplomatic." For the first time since he had met her, the Queen laughed quietly. The sound was soft but genuine. Adrian looked very pleased with himself. "I am beginning to understand your people's culture better," he said. "How so?" "You were extremely polite about arresting me yesterday." One of the guards near the door coughed suspiciously. Lysara moved slowly through the projection field, examining the growing number of translations Adrian had produced overnight. Her movements became slower the more she read. "These records," she said quietly. Adrian glanced toward her. "Yes? These details were lost when my empire collapsed." Adrian leaned back against the console. "That's the strange thing about languages," he said. "Even when civilizations disappear, the structure of their thought stays hidden inside the grammar." She looked at him again. "You speak of language as if it remembers." Adrian shrugged. "In a way it does." He gestured toward the floating symbols. "Every sentence carries traces of the world that created it. Politics, culture, jokes." "Jokes!" "Oh, yes." He highlighted another fragment. "This one appears to be a piece of Illyrian humor." Lysara leaned closer. "What does it say?" Adrian read it aloud. "Never argue with a royal mathematician. They will prove you wrong using numbers you cannot pronounce." The Queen stared at the text. Then she nodded slowly. "That is accurate." Adrian smiled. "I suspected your civilization had a sense of humor." Lysara continued studying the projections. Her expression grew more thoughtful with every fragment she read. "These records," she said quietly, "describe places that no longer exist." Adrian softened his voice slightly. "I know." She pointed to one translation. "That city was destroyed during the final war." Adrian looked at the symbol cluster. "Your language still remembers it." The Queen stood silently for several seconds. Then she turned toward him again. "Adrian Vale." "Yes? How long have you been studying Illyrian?" 6 months. Her long ears shifted slightly. 6 months. "Yes." "That is impossible." Adrian scratched his head. "Well, I did skip several meals." "That is not the issue." She gestured toward the entire projection field surrounding them. "These translations represent decades of work." Adrian glanced at the symbols, then at her. "Well," he said carefully, "in my defense, your language is extremely logical." She folded her arms. "It was designed that way." Adrian nodded. which means someone who understands the underlying structure can rebuild the missing pieces. He paused, usually with less accidental royal name revelations. Lysara watched him quietly. You reconstructed my people's grammar faster than any known scholar. Adrian thought about that. Is that bad? That depends. On what? She looked back at the floating archive. On how much more you are capable of uncovering. Adrian followed her gaze. Thousands of untranslated symbols still waited in the ancient archives. He smiled slightly. Oh, he said, probably quite a lot. By the fourth day of the investigation, the Interstellar Archive Station had quietly accepted a new and slightly unsettling reality. Adrian Vale was now working directly with a galactic queen. The guards still followed him everywhere. Adrian had started naming them. The tall one near the main door was Very Serious Guard Number 1. The other one, who blinked less often than most humans, had become Very Serious Guard Number 2. Neither seemed to appreciate the titles. Inside the main linguistic chamber, the air was filled with slowly rotating holographic fragments of Illyrian writing. Entire walls of the room had turned into living archives, displaying ancient symbols, reconstructed sentences, and branching language trees that Adrian had built over the last few days. Queen Lysara stood in the center of it all. She was reading one of the newly translated records when Adrian entered, carrying another cup of synthetic coffee and a datapad. Good news, Adrian announced. The Queen glanced toward him. That tone usually means trouble. Only academically. He placed the datapad onto the projection console and activated a new cluster of translations. These inscriptions come from a deep archive fragment we recovered yesterday. The language style is older than the imperial era. Lysara stepped closer to the display, her long ears tilted slightly back as she examined the symbols. This dialect, she murmured, it predates the royal expansion period. Adrian pointed to one of the glowing lines. Yes, exactly, which means the structure is simpler, but also much harder to interpret because your ancestors apparently enjoyed inventing grammar rules every 2 generations. That was considered cultural creativity. Adrian nodded slowly. Of course it was. He zoomed in on one particular inscription. This passage appears to be a royal engineering log. The Queen looked intrigued. Engineering? Yes. Adrian read the translation aloud. Stellar gate calibration successful. Dimensional resonance stabilized. Do not allow the royal mathematicians near the control console again. Lysara blinked. That is historically accurate. Adrian smiled. I'm beginning to like your civilization. One of the guards near the entrance muttered something quietly. Adrian ignored him. He continued scrolling through the reconstructed text. The interesting part, he said, is this section. Another cluster of symbols expanded across the chamber. These lines describe an early Illyrian communication protocol. Lysara leaned closer. Her eyes moved quickly across the translation. That cannot be correct, she said suddenly. Adrian frowned. Which part? This phrase. She pointed to the projection. The translation says linguistic resonance mapping. Adrian nodded. Yes. That concept did not exist in Illyrian science during that period. Adrian rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Well, it exists now. That is not reassuring. He adjusted the projection again. Look at the structure here. Several layers of language analysis appeared beneath the text. Syntax patterns, phonetic markers, mathematical relationships hidden inside the grammar. Adrian traced one of the patterns with his stylus. This entire system is based on resonance alignment between language structures and neural processing. Lysara looked at him. You believe my people designed language to interact with cognition? Adrian shrugged. I think your ancestors were much smarter than they looked in the historical records. That is insulting. It's also probably true. One of the guards coughed loudly. Lysara ignored him. She continued examining the translation. This passage describes a method of reconstructing lost knowledge by analyzing linguistic memory structures. Adrian smiled slightly. Yes. You understand what that means? I think so. She looked directly at him. It means our language was designed to preserve cultural memory, even if the physical records were destroyed. Adrian leaned back against the console. Exactly. The Queen's expression changed slowly as she considered that idea. If that is true, she said quietly, then someone studying the language deeply enough could reconstruct entire historical records. Adrian raised his coffee cup slightly. Welcome to my last 6 months. Lysara turned toward the surrounding projections again. Hundreds of Illyrian texts floated around them now. Military logs, philosophical writings, fragments of poetry, pieces of scientific research, all slowly rebuilt through Adrian's translations. This is not merely linguistic analysis, she said. No, this is historical reconstruction. Yes, she looked back at him. And you are doing it unintentionally. Adrian considered that. Well, I intended to do research. He gestured toward the massive holographic archive around them. I did not intend to accidentally rebuild a fallen civilization. The Queen studied him carefully. You speak about this very casually. Adrian took another sip of coffee. That's because if I think about it too seriously, I will panic. That seems reasonable. He nodded. I try to keep my professional breakdowns scheduled for weekends. Lysara almost smiled again, but her attention returned to the translation in front of her. This system, she said slowly, would allow someone to reconstruct memories encoded in the structure of the language itself. Adrian tapped the console. Yes. And if the language contains records that no longer exist, he paused, then technically speaking, Adrian finished, your civilization may not be as lost as everyone believed. The chamber grew quiet again. Outside the massive observation windows, the distant stars burned cold and silent. Lysara looked at the endless field of reconstructed texts surrounding them. Then she said something very softly. These are the voices of my people. Adrian glanced toward her. Yes. She touched one of the holographic inscriptions gently. They have been silent for centuries. Adrian smiled faintly. Well, he said, languages hate staying silent for too long. The Queen looked back at him. You may be the most dangerous historian in the galaxy. Adrian sighed. I was afraid of that. The fifth day of Adrian Vale's accidental involvement in royal Illyrian history began with an argument between him and a translation algorithm. This symbol clearly indicates a spatial navigation directive, Adrian insisted, pointing at the floating holographic glyph. The station's AI responded calmly. Probability of culinary reference, 47%. Adrian stared at the screen. Why would an interstellar empire record soup instructions inside a navigation tablet? Cultural variation exists. Adrian leaned back in his chair. Your cultural analysis needs therapy. Across the chamber, Queen Lysara watched the exchange in silence for several seconds. Then she spoke. It is not soup. Adrian looked relieved. Thank you. She stepped closer to the projection, studying the glyph. It refers to an early deep space relay station. The translation AI updated immediately. Correction acknowledged. Adrian nodded proudly. You see, I told you. He turned to Lysara. Although I do admit the soup theory had potential. The chamber was quieter today. Many of the station officials had stopped hovering nearby once it became clear that Adrian had not secretly infiltrated forbidden royal databases. The guards were still present, but now they mostly looked tired. Adrian suspected they had realized the greatest threat in the room was excessive academic discussion. At the center of the chamber, hundreds of Illyrian texts floated in slow motion around them. Over the past several days, Adrian had reconstructed an astonishing amount of the lost civilization's language. Entire records had begun to appear from fragments that once seemed meaningless. Lysara walked slowly through the projections. Each text seemed to pull her deeper into memories she had not expected to revisit. This one, she said quietly, stopping near a cluster of inscriptions. Adrian rolled his chair closer. Yes, she pointed to a glowing passage. This describes a scientific council on Ayria Prime. Adrian scanned the translation. Oh yes, that one was interesting. Why? He smiled slightly. It contains the earliest reference to your people's resonance technology. Lysara's expression changed. That research was extremely restricted. Adrian nodded. Yes, I noticed. He zoomed in on the text. Apparently, the early Illyrian scientists discovered something unusual about language structures. Lysara crossed her arms. That is an understatement. Adrian tapped the projection again. These records suggest that certain linguistic patterns can interact with neural resonance frequencies. One of the guards frowned. That sounds like nonsense. Adrian looked at him. Congratulations. You just summarized most of theoretical science. The guard did not appear amused. Lysara continued reading the translation carefully. This passage describes experimental memory preservation. Adrian nodded again. Yes. You believe my ancestors embedded cultural knowledge directly into the language itself. I do. She turned toward him slowly. That would require extremely advanced cognitive science. Adrian shrugged. Your ancestors were running an interstellar empire. They probably had time for side projects. One of the guards muttered something about humans having strange humor. Adrian ignored him. He activated another translation layer. This next section is the part that really caught my attention. More symbols appeared in the air. These records describe something called the archive mind. Lysara froze slightly. Adrian noticed immediately. You've heard of it. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Yes. Adrian leaned forward. I suspected that. She studied the translation again. The archive mind was a theoretical project proposed during the final centuries of Ayria. Adrian's eyes lit up. Ah, so it was real? Not exactly. She pointed at the projection. It was never completed. Adrian tilted his head. That depends on your definition of completed. Lysara frowned. Explain. He expanded the translation field again. These inscriptions describe a system designed to preserve the cultural memory of the Ayrian civilization using linguistic resonance patterns. That was the theory. Adrian nodded. And your language still contains those patterns. The Queen looked at the endless floating texts surrounding them. You believe the archive mind still exists inside the language? Adrian lifted his coffee cup thoughtfully. Well, if it does, that would explain why I keep reconstructing historical records that technically shouldn't exist anymore. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them spoke quietly. You are suggesting that the entire Ayrian civilization left behind a hidden memory system. Adrian nodded casually. Yes. That is impossible. Adrian smiled. That word has been very popular this week. Lysara stepped closer to one of the inscriptions. Her long ears angled slightly back as she read the ancient text again. If the archive mind truly survived, she said slowly, then fragments of my people's knowledge may still be preserved. Adrian pointed gently at the holographic projections around them. I believe we are already looking at them. She turned toward him. And you can access this system simply by studying the language? Adrian shrugged. Apparently. That should not be possible. Agreed. The Queen studied him carefully again. How long did it take you to understand the core structure of Ayrian grammar? Adrian thought for a moment. 3 weeks. One of the guards nearly choked. 3 weeks? Adrian nodded. Yes. That language required decades for trained scholars to interpret. Adrian smiled politely. Well, I did skip several meals. The guard stared at him. That cannot be the reason. Adrian leaned back in his chair again. Honestly, I don't know why it works. He gestured toward the floating text. Something about the structure just makes sense. Lysara looked at him in silence for several seconds. Then she said quietly, My people believed that language carried the shape of thought itself. Adrian nodded slowly. That would explain a lot. The chamber fell silent again. Outside the station windows, the stars continued their slow movement across the void. Lysara looked once more at the growing archive of reconstructed Ayrian history. You may not realize it yet, she said softly. Adrian glanced toward her. Realize what? She gestured toward the language surrounding them. You are not simply translating my civilization? Adrian raised an eyebrow. No? No. She looked directly into his eyes. You may be waking it up. Adrian did not sleep well after hearing the phrase, you may be waking it up. Not because he was frightened, because his brain refused to stop working. By morning, the main linguistic chamber looked less like a research facility and more like the inside of a starship engine built entirely from language. Thousands of Ayrian symbols filled the air, connected by glowing threads of syntax patterns and structural relationships. Adrian stood in the middle of it all, wearing a wrinkled shirt and the expression of a man who had consumed far too much caffeine. Queen Lysara entered quietly. She stopped just inside the doorway. For several seconds, she simply watched the enormous web of language floating across the chamber. Adrian noticed her and waved. "Good morning," he said. The queen slowly stepped forward, her long ears tilting slightly as she examined the projections. "How long have you been awake?" Adrian checked his wrist console. "Technically, yes. Approximately 14 hours. That is not technically. Then 22. Lysara folded her arms. "That explains the chaos." Adrian glanced around proudly. "I prefer the word progress." He tapped a control panel, and the floating symbols shifted position, revealing a massive structural diagram of the Illyrian language. "This," Adrian said enthusiastically, "is the core resonance map." The queen looked at it carefully. Her expression changed almost immediately. "You found it." Adrian blinked. "Oh, good. That means it's correct." She walked closer to the projection, studying the pattern. "These structures were theoretical," she said quietly. "The Archive Mind project never moved beyond experimental models." Adrian scratched his head. "Well, either your scientists underestimated their progress," he gestured toward the glowing network of linguistic pathways, "or your ancestors were very bad at labeling their research notes." One of the guards at the doorway muttered something that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Adrian zoomed into a section of the diagram. "You see this alignment pattern?" Lysara nodded slowly. "Yes. It links phonetic structures with cognitive resonance frequencies." "That was the core idea." Adrian smiled. "Then your people actually built it." The queen looked at him. "You are certain?" Adrian highlighted several pathways across the projection. "These grammatical connections form a recursive network. Each phrase references structural memory markers embedded inside the language." He paused. "Basically, your civilization built a memory storage system using grammar." The guards looked confused again. Adrian noticed. "Imagine if every sentence ever spoken by humanity secretly contained instructions for rebuilding Earth's entire history." One of the guards frowned. "That sounds impossible." Adrian shrugged. "Your galaxy keeps using that word." Lysara continued studying the diagram. Her voice grew quieter. "This system would allow knowledge to survive even if all physical records were destroyed." Adrian nodded. "Yes. And if someone reconstructed the language deeply enough, they could access those preserved memories." The queen looked at him again. "You are doing exactly that." Adrian rubbed his eyes. "Apparently." She examined the projection again. "Yet there is a problem." Adrian looked up. "Oh? Yes." She pointed to the central structure of the resonance map. "This system was designed to respond only to Illyrian neural patterns." Adrian followed her finger. He frowned slightly. "That is interesting." "Why?" "Because it seems to respond to mine." The room became quiet again. One of the guards shifted uneasily. "That should not be possible." Adrian leaned against the console. "Welcome to the mystery." Lysara studied him carefully. "How did you begin learning our language?" Adrian shrugged. "I found a broken tablet in the archive storage 3 months ago." "That is all?" "Well, I also found 27 other fragments, 2 corrupted data crystals, and a poetry collection written by a very dramatic Illyrian philosopher." The queen raised an eyebrow. "Dramatic?" "He compared mathematics to romantic heartbreak." "That sounds accurate." Adrian laughed quietly. "Your people were strange." She looked around the chamber again. "These translations you produced?" "Yes. They include personal records." Adrian nodded. "Some of them." She pointed toward a floating inscription near the ceiling. "That text describes a royal council meeting." Adrian looked up. "Oh, that one. That meeting occurred 900 years ago." "Yes. There are no surviving records of it." Adrian shrugged again. "The language remembered." The queen slowly walked toward the projection. Her hand hovered near the glowing text. "My people believed that language was alive." Adrian tilted his head. "Define alive." "Not conscious." She touched the projection lightly. "But capable of preserving thought." Adrian watched her quietly. "You miss them," he said softly. She did not answer immediately. Outside the observation windows, distant stars drifted across the darkness. Finally, she said, "I remember an entire civilization." Adrian looked at the floating network of reconstructed Illyrian knowledge surrounding them. That must be exhausting. She glanced at him. Yes, Adrian smiled faintly. Well, good news. What? He gestured toward the glowing language web filling the chamber. You may not have to remember alone anymore. The queen looked at the vast projection again. The ancient language of her people filled the room like a quiet echo returning after centuries of silence. For the first time since the investigation began, Lysara looked uncertain. Then she asked the question that had been waiting in the air all week. Adrian Vale? Yes. How is the system responding to you? Adrian thought for a moment. Then he pointed toward the center of the resonance map. A small cluster of symbols had begun slowly rearranging themselves. None of them had activated that function. Adrian frowned. Well, he said carefully, that part is new. The symbols in the center of the chamber continued rearranging themselves. No one touched the console. No one issued a command. Yet the glowing cluster of Illyrian language slowly rotated, shifting into new patterns like pieces of a puzzle, deciding where they belonged. Adrian stared at it for several seconds. Then he quietly set his coffee cup down. That, he said calmly, is extremely interesting. One of the guards stepped forward immediately. Is it dangerous? Adrian tilted his head. Well, historically speaking, when ancient alien systems activate on their own, it's usually either a breakthrough in science or the beginning of a disaster. The guard frowned. That is not reassuring. Queen Lysara had not moved. Her gaze remained fixed on the changing symbols. Her long ears angled slightly forward now, a subtle sign of intense attention. That pattern, she murmured. Adrian glanced at her. You recognize it? Yes. She stepped closer to the projection. The symbols slowly aligned into a circular structure, a complex web of Illyrian characters forming an intricate linguistic equation. Lysara exhaled softly. It is a memory sequence. Adrian's eyes lit up. Oh, good. The guard crossed his arms. How is that good? Adrian pointed at the projection. Because if this is what I think it is, your civilization's archive mind just responded to us. Lysara turned toward him. To you. Adrian shrugged slightly. I'm trying not to take that personally. The glowing structure expanded outward. New fragments of Illyrian text appeared across the chamber, linking themselves to the existing language web Adrian had built over the past week. The room slowly filled with additional records, historical data, scientific writings, personal logs, centuries of lost Illyrian knowledge flowing quietly back into existence. The guards looked overwhelmed. Adrian looked fascinated. Well, he said, adjusting the console controls, that confirms the system works. Lysara watched the projections with an expression Adrian had never seen before. It was not authority, it was not curiosity, it was something softer. Those records, she said quietly. Adrian nodded. Yes, they were lost. Apparently not. The queen walked slowly through the floating archive. Her fingers brushed lightly through the glowing text. This is the council archive. She moved to another projection. And these are the scientific academies. Another. The northern cities. Adrian leaned back against the console, giving her space. For centuries she had carried the memory of her people alone. Now the chamber was filled with their voices again. One of the guards finally spoke. So the human accidentally rebuilt an ancient alien civilization's memory system. Adrian raised a finger. In my defense, I was just trying to finish a translation project. The guard sighed. That explanation does not make this situation less strange. Lysara stopped beside a cluster of personal records. Her eyes moved across the ancient text slowly. These are family histories. Adrian nodded quietly. The language preserved them. She looked back toward him. And you uncovered them. Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. Well, technically the grammar did most of the work. You decoded it. That part is true. The queen studied him carefully. You realize what this means. Adrian glanced around the chamber. Yes. My civilization is no longer silent. He nodded again. And the galaxy now has a very large new history archive. One of the guards groaned softly. That means paperwork. Adrian pointed at him. You understand the true horror of discovery. Lysara almost smiled. She returned to the central projection where the memory sequence had first appeared. The symbols were still moving slowly, but now their pattern was stable. Adrian stepped beside her. So, he said, I have a theory. Of course you do. I think the archive mind wasn't designed to activate automatically. Lysara raised an eyebrow. Explain. Adrian tapped the console, highlighting several pathways in the resonance network. The system reacts when someone reconstructs enough of the language to complete the neural resonance structure. She studied the diagram. So it required a translator. Yes, an Ayrian translator. Adrian hesitated slightly. That would have been the original design. She looked directly at him. But it responded to you. Adrian smiled awkwardly. Apparently your ancestors didn't anticipate curious humans with caffeine addictions. One of the guards shook his head slowly. That may be the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Adrian accepted this with pride. Lysara continued watching the memory network. For centuries, she said softly, I believed I was the last voice of Ayria. Adrian gestured toward the glowing archive surrounding them. Turns out your people were excellent at backups. She turned toward him. You gave them back to the galaxy. Adrian shrugged gently. I just listened to what the language was trying to say. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Adrian Vale. Yes? You should remain here. He blinked. In the archive? Yes. She gestured toward the enormous linguistic network surrounding them. My civilization has just been rediscovered. Adrian looked around the chamber. The lost knowledge of an entire people now floated quietly in the air. I suppose someone should organize it. Exactly. He thought about that. Then he smiled slightly. Well, Adrian said, picking up his coffee again, I always did enjoy talking to ghosts. Lysara looked back at the glowing language of her people. For the first time in centuries, she was no longer the only one who could hear them. And somewhere inside the endless web of Ayrian memory, a civilization that had once vanished among the stars was beginning, slowly, to speak again,